Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I'm so glad you could join us today because we are zeroing in on a highly specific, historically monumental theological text.
Yeah, we really are. It's a weighty one.
It is. We are looking at an excerpt from chapter 13 of John Owen's A Dissertation on Divine Justice. And the mission for our conversation today, our deep dive, is to answer one massive question.
Right.
Can the Almighty forgive sins by his sheer omnipotence without requiring a satisfaction?
Which is a huge question.
Huge, meaning could the creator of the universe simply wave his hand, bypass any penalty or atonement, and just let sin slide?
Yeah.
So we've got a heavyweight theological bout here. On one side is a scholar named Twisse, and he's drawing heavily on the medieval arguments of Duns Scotus.
Right, Scotus a big influence there.
And Twisse argues that God, possessing absolute capability and might, could theoretically dismiss sin if he wanted to. There's nothing stopping him from doing so.
That's his claim, yeah.
And then on the other side, we have John Owen mounting a relentless defense of the strict necessity of divine justice.
And I think we really need to set the stakes for you here, because the stakes are as high as they get. This isn't, it's not academic hair splitting.
Yeah.
Or, hypothetical philosophizing. If God has the capacity to let sin slide by sheer choice, then the entire basis of the moral universe shifts.
Yeah, it really does.
The absolute necessity of the cross comes into question. I mean, if the Almighty could have pardoned sin by a fiat of his will, then the agonizing death of the Son wasn't strictly required.
It becomes an option.
Yes, a choice among many, rather than the singular, unavoidable meeting place of his holy nature and the salvation of the elect.
Right.
John Owen's goal is to prove that justice is as essential to the nature of God as his very existence. It isn't a coat he puts on and takes off. It's who he is.
So to understand why God can't just wave away sin, we have to look at how Twisse tries to trap Owen using God's own attributes.
Oh, it's such a clever trap, too.
It is. Twisse sets up this dilemma. He says, if God cannot forgive without a satisfaction, it must be either because his justice prevents it or his omnipotence prevents it. Right. And then Twisse claims neither can be proven, so he's trying to corner Owen by dividing God's characteristics.
Yeah, pulling them apart.
But separating God's attributes like this, it feels like asking if water is wet because of its hydrogen or its oxygen.
That is a great way to put it.
It's a false division, You can't pull the molecule apart and still have the substance of water. When Twisse pits the Almighty's capability against his justice, he's playing a philosophical shell game.
He absolutely is. And Owen looks at Twisse's argument and dismisses it as a trifling view.
Trifling. I love that word.
Yeah, he's calling it a trifling view of the divine attributes because it completely misunderstands divine simplicity.
Okay, unpack that for us.
Well, God isn't a collection of parts. He doesn't have a justice department that argues with an omnipotence department in some heavenly boardroom.
Right.
Owen argues that what God cannot do in respect to one essential property, he cannot do in respect to any. The attributes of God are perfectly unified.
They're all one.
Yes, they are identical with his essence. If something violates his justice, his omnipotence won't override that justice to accomplish it. The divine attributes don't compete.
Yeah.
They operate in perfect harmony because they are the singular nature of the one true God.
And Owen uses the example of truth to illustrate this unified nature. Like, we all agree it contradicts God's nature to lie, right?
Absolutely.
God's truth. So Owen says, if there is anything which God cannot do in respect of truth, he cannot do that in any manner whatsoever.
Yes.
He can't use his immense capability to tell a lie. His might doesn't give him the ability to act against his own truthfulness.
That's a perfect parallel.
So Twisse's attempt to say, well, maybe God's might allows him to bypass his justice, it falls completely flat. If it violates justice, it violates God, and therefore God cannot do it, period.
Which brings us to a really crucial theological distinction Owen makes regarding how we understand the capabilities of the Almighty.
Okay.
Owen introduces the concept of the divided sense.
The divided sense.
Right. In the acts of the divine will that are purely free, God has infinite capability. So in a divided sense, meaning looking at his capability in the abstract, apart from any specific decrees he has made, God possesses the sheer capability to create 1,000 new worlds.
Wow. Yeah, abstractly speaking.
Right. He could have made a universe with entirely different physical laws, or he could have chosen not to create anything at all. That's his absolute capability in the abstract.
Okay, I follow you.
But once he makes a decree, like creating this specific world with rational creatures subject to his moral law, He operates within the absolute necessity of his own established order.
Oh, that makes sense.
He can't contradict the order he has decreed because that would contradict his own wisdom and truth.
So when you, the listener, think about the capabilities of the Creator, you can't pit his omnipotence against his justice.
No, you can't.
They are a perfectly unified whole. You can't imagine a scenario where God flexes his muscles to overpower his own moral standards.
Yeah, that would be absurd.
If he established a universe where rational creatures owe him perfect obedience, and those creatures fall into utter ruin and rebellion, his justice demands a response.
The necessary response.
Right. His omnipotence won't be used to smuggle those rebels out the back door of the courtroom without the demands of justice being fully met.
Precisely. And because Owen thoroughly demolishes that first trap regarding the unity of the attributes, Twisse has to pivot.
He's got to try a new angle.
Yeah, he realizes he can't divide the attributes, so he attacks the idea of omnipotence directly. Twisse argues that if God has absolute might, saying he can't pardon sin, is a literal contradiction in terms.
Right, because absolute might should mean you can do anything, according to Twisse.
That's his logic. He tries to argue that a truly supreme being must have the prerogative to let things go. And to prove his point, Twisse points to human behavior.
Oh, the human analogy.
Yeah. He says, we humans pardon our enemies all the time. It's our moral duty to forgive those who wrong us. Why can't the creator of the universe do what we do on a daily basis?
And this objection resonates with so many people today. I hear this all the time.
Oh, constantly.
Let's look at an everyday scenario to strengthen Twisse's premise before we dismantle it, because we need to be fair to the argument.
Sure.
If someone borrows my car and, while parking it, they scrape the side against a concrete pillar, it's a nasty scratch.
Ouch.
Yeah. They return the keys, apologize profusely, and confess what they did. Now, as the owner of the car, I have the right to demand they pay for the body shop repairs.
Right.
But I also have the capacity to just look at them and say, don't worry about it. I forgive you. I'll absorb the cost myself. I can just let it go.
You have that personal right.
Exactly. I mean, that's spot on. So Twisse is asking, why can't the sovereign of the universe absorb the cost of sin? Why can't he look at our rebellion and say, don't worry about it, I'll just let it go?
It sounds appealing on the surface. It really does.
Mm-hmm.
But Owen mounts a devastating counteroffensive against this human analogy, and he breaks it down into 4 distinct areas where human forgiveness and divine forgiveness are entirely different categories.
Okay, let's go through those.
First, he points out the difference between hurt and guilt. Human forgiveness only deals with personal hurt or injury.
Like my car.
Yes, like the car. If someone scratches your car or insults you or wrongs you personally, you can forgive that specific injury. But divine forgiveness deals with guilt on a cosmic scale.
Wow, cosmic scale.
Because sin isn't just a personal slight against God's feelings. It's an injury to the good of the entire universe. It's a violation of the fundamental moral order. You can forgive a personal hurt, but you can't absolve universal guilt simply by brushing it off.
And we also have to look at the difference between a private citizen and a public official. Like, in my car analogy, I'm a private citizen.
Right.
I can drop a grudge out of charity. But think about a judge sitting on the bench in a courtroom. A convicted bank robber is standing before him.
Yeah, totally different situation.
The judge might be a very kind, charitable person in his private life, but in his capacity as a judge, he can't legally look at the bank robber and say, you know what? I'm feeling generous today. I forgive you. You're free to go.
He'd be removed from the bench.
Absolutely. The judge has a right of government that he cannot renounce without hurting the public. If he lets criminals go, the law loses all meaning and society collapses.
That is such a crucial point. A public person cannot renounce a right of government if doing so harms the public good. And this points to Owen's third distinction. Indispensable dominion.
Indispensable dominion.
Yes. Human judges derive their authority from a higher source, but God's right to rule is natural, supreme, and indispensable. He is the ultimate public official, the supreme judge of all the earth.
Yeah.
He can't renounce his right of dominion because doing so would mean denying himself. He can't step down from being God. He can't pretend that his moral law doesn't matter because his moral law is an expression of his own perfect character. For him to ignore sin would be for him to act as though he is not the holy sovereign.
And the fourth point Owen makes is that impunity is an affront to the divine glory. If sin goes completely unpunished, the glory of divine justice is insulted with impunity. It sends a message to the entire cosmos that rebellion against the Creator carries no real weight.
It's a terrifying thought.
It would be a catastrophic injury to the moral fabric of reality. Owen says that letting sin pass unpunished implies a virtual contradiction.
A virtual contradiction.
Right. It might not be a formal contradiction in a strict grammatical sense, like saying a square is a circle, but in the reality of who God is, it's contradictory.
Yeah.
God is the supreme Lord. Humans are the subjects. Sin violently cuts off this necessary dependence that a rational creature owes its creator. To restore that balance, to repair that cosmic breach, there must be either perfect obedience or punishment. There's no third option of just ignoring it.
This concept of the virtual contradiction is vital for you to grasp. The dependence of the creature on the creator isn't just a physical reality, it's a moral reality. When a creature sins, they're attempting to sever that moral dependence. They're declaring themselves an independent authority. If God were to simply wave that away, he would be validating their false independence.
He'd be agreeing with them.
Yes. He would be saying that their rebellion is acceptable, or at least tolerable. That contradicts his nature as the sole supreme authority. To ignore sin is to agree with the sinner's premise that God's law isn't absolute.
You know, there's something truly shocking in Twisse's argument, relying on Scotus. They suggest that because God's will is free, he could theoretically love sin.
I know it's jarring.
They argue that if he hates sin purely by a free choice of his will, he could just as easily choose the opposite and love it. When I read that in the sources, it honestly stopped me in my tracks.
Oh, Owen treats that speculation with absolute theological horror. He points out the massive flaw in Scotus and Twisse's logic. They're assuming God's hatred of sin is just an arbitrary choice.
It's like picking a favorite color.
Exactly. I mean, yes, like choosing to paint a room blue instead of red. But Owen argues that hating sin is as natural to God as being himself. To will good and to love justice are identical to his very being.
Wow.
God can't love sin any more than he can cease to exist. His nature is perfectly holy, which means his reaction to unholiness is a necessary natural hatred. It isn't an arbitrary decision.
Right.
Asserting that God could absolutely forgive sin without satisfaction inherently contains a double contradiction. It assumes God can renounce his indispensable lordship, and it assumes he can act against his own holy nature by failing to hate that which is evil.
But Twisse doesn't get up easily. He realizes that if God must punish sin, if it's a necessary outflow of his nature, then it sounds like God is forced into action.
That's where he goes next.
Yeah, this leads to his next attack, which we'll call the mindless force objection. Twisse argues that if God can't let sin pass, then he punishes from a blind, absolute necessity. And if he's acting out of absolute necessity, he's robbed of his free will.
He loses his sovereignty in Twisse's mind.
Right. He becomes like a machine that dispenses punishment automatically the very moment a sin occurs.
Twisse is trying to make Owen's view look ridiculous by reducing the Almighty to a mere force of nature. If justice demands punishment so rigidly, Twisse asks, where is God's sovereignty? Where is his free choice?
How does Owen get out of that?
Well, Owen's rebuttal introduces a brilliant distinction between two kinds of necessity. First, there's absolute necessity. This is a necessity of nature that is eternal and non-contingent.
Okay, give me an example.
For example, the Father begetting the Son is an absolute necessity of the divine nature. It's eternal. It doesn't depend on any outside condition.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. And the second kind of necessity Owen introduces is conditional necessity.
Yes.
God didn't have to create the world. He wasn't lonely or lacking anything. He chose to create the universe entirely freely.
Right.
But upon the supposition that he chose to create rational beings, and upon the supposition that he permitted those rational beings to transgress the law of their creation, then it becomes conditionally necessary that he punish them.
Exactly.
The punishment is necessary, but it's based on a condition that God freely established in the first place.
He freely chose to speak creation into existence. Having chosen to speak, it's impossible for him not to speak truthfully. His truthfulness is absolutely necessary, but it's exercised upon the condition of his free choice to speak.
Oh, that's a great parallel.
In the same way, he freely chose to create moral agents. Once they sinned, his justice necessitates punishment. He doesn't punish from a blind, absolute necessity that overrides his will, but from a necessity that arises because of the conditions he freely decreed.
But hold on, you're losing me just a bit. I can hear a listener pushing back on this, asking, doesn't that still mean God is reacting on autopilot when a sin happens? Even if it's a conditional necessity once the condition is met, isn't he just reacting mechanically?
It's a fair question.
Because if the condition triggers the response automatically, I don't see where his free will factors into the actual act of punishment.
And Owen answers that exact concern with the concept of concomitant liberty.
Concomitant liberty?
Right. Concomitant liberty means that while God punishes necessarily, because his holy nature requires it, he does so freely, by his own volition, and with complete understanding.
Okay, so he's not just a reflex?
Not at all. He isn't a robot running a software program. He acts according to what his most holy nature requires, but he does so with total awareness, absolute freedom of will, and perfect intention. He is entirely engaged in the act of justice. The necessity of his nature and the freedom of his will operate simultaneously without contradicting each other.
But then Twisse brings up a follow-up argument. He says, well, if it's a natural necessity to punish, God must punish to the maximum extent of his capability.
Which is a wild jump in logic.
It really is. The idea is that natural forces expand until they run out of energy. A fire burns everything it can reach. A flood destroys everything in its path until the water recedes. Twisse argues that if God's justice is a natural necessity, he would obliterate everything with maximum force.
Yeah.
And to answer this, Owen cites the defense made by Vossius.
Vossius, and Owen agreeing with him, points out that Twisse is building on a false supposition. He's treating God like a senseless, inanimate agent.
Right.
The defense is that God punishes as far as is just, not as far as he is capable. His omnipotence is infinite, but his exercise of punishment is regulated by his perfect justice.
Wow, that's a beautiful distinction.
It really is. He doesn't blindly unleash infinite destruction just because he can. He measures the punishment precisely according to the strict demands of justice. He does all things freely, with understanding, even when acting upon a conditional necessity. He isn't a blind force. He is the perfectly wise, perfectly just sovereign.
You know, this idea of God acting naturally but freely brings up another major objection, this time from a scholar named Vossius. And this objection brings us right to the very heart of the gospel.
It really does.
It deals with how punishment is applied. Vossius argues that natural agents act on naturally receptive objects. Fire burns whatever is closest to it. It doesn't choose what to burn, it just burns.
That's his claim.
So Vossius says, if God punishing sin is a natural necessity, the punishment absolutely must fall on the actual individual sinner. It can't be transferred to someone else. The fire must consume the specific object that is near it.
And Owen agrees with Vossius on one point. God is indeed a consuming fire, as the scriptures declare. But Owen clarifies that he is an intellectual consuming fire.
An intellectual fire.
Yes. He isn't a senseless, inanimate force of nature that blindly incinerates whatever is in front of it. Because he possesses infinite wisdom and concomitant liberty, he has the capacity to direct that fire.
And this is where we see the role of the surety. This is the pivotal theological climax of the text.
It gives me chills every time I think about it.
Me too. Owen explains that antecedent to the actual act of vindicatory justice against the elect, God appointed a surety, a substitute. He freely chose to appoint someone to stand in the place of the guilty.
The necessity of the punishment is absolute.
Yeah.
The violated right of God must be recovered. The guilt must be dealt with. But because God is an intellectual consuming fire, he can ordain a specific mechanism for that justice to be satisfied.
Right.
He appointed the surety, and all the sins of the elect were laid upon him. By that appointment, the surety actually becomes the proper object of vindicatory justice. The fire of God's wrath doesn't fall on the substitute arbitrarily. It falls on him because, by divine appointment, he has taken the guilt upon himself.
And the text references 2 Corinthians 5:21, which says, He hath made him to be sin for us who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him.
Amen.
Because the surety was appointed and the sins were laid upon him, he becomes the proper target for the demands of justice. Let's slow down here to make sure you, the listener, grasp the immense weight of this.
It's vital.
God's justice absolutely had to be satisfied. There was no bypassing it. His intellectual liberty, his supreme wisdom, allowed him to appoint a substitute to absorb the blow meant for the sinner. The wrath was necessary, but the substitution was the deliberate provision of a free and merciful God.
His justice remains utterly uncompromised, and his mercy is brilliantly displayed. If Twisse were right, and God could forgive without a satisfaction, then the cross becomes a tragic, unnecessary event.
Just a horrific accident.
Yes. But because Owen is right, the cross is the supreme demonstration of both the unavoidable necessity of justice and the breathtaking depth of divine love. The surety takes the full measure of what is just, perfectly satisfying the conditional necessity of punishment.
So Twisse has one final, incredibly intricate trap to spring regarding the rules of punishment and reward. It's a double-edged sword concerning what creatures actually deserve.
He's throwing everything at the wall.
He really is. Twisse argues that if sin deserves punishment naturally, without God simply choosing to make it so, then obedience must naturally deserve a reward. He tries to force an equivalence.
Right. Then Twisse claims this equivalence is absurd. He points out that even angels don't naturally merit celestial glory simply for doing their jobs. He concludes neither punishment nor reward are naturally necessary. They are just whatever God freely decides them to be.
Twisse is basically saying that if you can't obligate God to reward you for obedience, then your disobedience can't obligate God to punish you.
Which sounds logical until you really examine it.
Exactly. That's spot on. To dismantle this, Owen provides a masterful two-part anatomy of punishment. He breaks punishment down into two distinct categories. First, there's the punishment itself, the grievous consequence necessary to recover God's violated right.
Okay.
This part, Owen insists, is strictly necessary. It is due antecedently to any free choice. If sin occurs, punishment must follow. That is the necessary component.
And the second category is where the freedom comes in. While the punishment itself is necessary, the mode, the time, and the degree of that punishment are governed by God's free constitution.
God freely decides how the punishment is administered, when it's poured out, and the specific degrees of severity based on his infinite wisdom.
The demand for justice is inflexible, but the administration of that justice is orchestrated by God's sovereign will.
Yeah.
He doesn't lash out in a blind rage. He calculates the mode, time, and degree with absolute perfection.
Yeah.
He determines whether the punishment falls immediately or is delayed. He determines whether it falls on the individual sinner or upon the appointed surety at Golgotha. The that of punishment is necessary. The how and when are freely constituted by God.
Let me bring in an analogy to help visualize this distinction for you.
Yeah.
Think of it like a massive financial debt. Knowing that a legitimate debt absolutely must be paid, that's the necessary part. You can't just ignore the debt.
Right, the bank won't let you.
No, they won't. The creditor's right to his money is indispensable. But whether that debt is paid in cash, by a bank transfer, today, tomorrow, or in installments, is decided by the terms set by the creditor.
The conditions of the payment.
Right. That represents the mode and time. The debt of sin absolutely must be paid to satisfy justice, but the Creator freely determined the specific mode and time of that payment at the cross.
And we must address Twisse's trap about obedience, too. Twisse said that if punishment is natural, reward must be natural, too. Owen cuts right through this by pointing out a fundamental asymmetry of merit.
Asymmetry of merit.
Right. The relationship between obedience and reward isn't the same as the relationship between disobedience and punishment. They aren't two equal sides of a scale.
And this is where we run into the concept of the unprofitable servant. Owen's view on human merit is crystal clear. There is no natural obligation whatsoever for God to reward us for doing what we are already created to do.
None.
Even if a human being were to live a life of perfect, flawless obedience, after doing all that we're supposed to do, we are still just unprofitable servants. We have only done our duty.
Yeah, God owes us absolutely nothing.
Nothing at all. Any reward he gives is a matter of his free, gracious constitution, not a natural debt he owes to the creature.
This asymmetry is so vital to grasp. Obedience is simply maintaining the baseline of the relationship. It's doing what a dependent creature ought to do. It brings no new profit to the Creator.
Right.
Disobedience is entirely different. Disobedience actively destroys the creature's dependence on God. It's an act of violent rebellion that violates God's indispensable right of dominion.
It's an attack.
It is. And because it breaks the fundamental order of the universe, a recompense of punishment becomes strictly, naturally necessary to restore that right. You can't earn a wage from God by breathing his air and doing what he commanded, but you absolutely incur a necessary debt of punishment by rebelling against his throne.
And the sources briefly touch on Vossius' point about mercy versus justice, which perfectly highlights this asymmetry. Vossius tries to make a comparison, but Owen shows it's improperly instituted.
Yeah, there are different categories.
Mercy is natural to God as a habit, a characteristic of his being, but the acts of mercy are entirely free because there is no natural obligation between God and the object of mercy. He isn't forced to show mercy to a rebel. Justice operates differently. While God isn't obligated to the rebel, he is obligated to himself. His justice is indispensable because to ignore a violation of his law would be to deny his own holiness. Mercy is freely given, justice is strictly required.
So we started by looking at God's attributes not as competing factions, but as an indivisible, unified whole. We examined why dismissing sin without a satisfaction would force God to contradict his very nature as the supreme judge of the universe.
Yeah.
We analyzed the brilliant distinction between absolute and conditional necessity, proving that God acts freely and intelligently even when his holy nature requires him to punish.
Intellectual consuming fire.
Exactly. Yes, the intellectual consuming fire. We saw how that nature allowed for the appointment of a surety, a substitute who could bear the strict demands of justice in our place. And we looked at the fundamental asymmetry between obedience and disobedience, recognizing that while we can never obligate God to reward us, our sin makes our punishment an indispensable necessity.
Here's a final thought for you to mull over as we close today. If God's justice is an absolute, unavoidable necessity, and if we, as unprofitable servants, are completely incapable of obligating him to reward us, consider the sheer, deliberate intention behind the cross.
It's staggering.
The crucifixion wasn't a tragic accident. It wasn't a sudden backup plan when human history went off the rails. It was the only logical, necessary meeting place of indispensable justice and free, unmerited mercy. How does grasping the mathematical, rigorous, logical necessity of the atonement alter your daily perception of the grace you have received? Thank you for joining us on this intense deep dive into the historical theology of John Owen. Keep asking the hard questions, keep seeking the immense logic behind what you believe, and we'll see you next time.